will beat RJ so badly he ends up in the hospital. Ridge says he will sue Will and send him to jail. Will Spencer and RJ Forrester were at the center of it all. They were two young men with famous last names, complicated family histories, and unresolved grudges that had nothing to do with fashion or family businesses and everything to do with pride, jealousy, and identity. RJ had always been the one who talked less. Creative, thoughtful, and more interested in sketchbooks than fighting in the boardroom. RJ was Ridge Forrester's son, so people always had high hopes for him, but he never made them known. He tried to avoid getting into fights, especially when it came to the Spencer family. He knew from history that those wars didn't lead to anything good. Will, on the other hand, grew up in a world of power and privilege. He was Bill Spencer's son, and he had grown up seeing dominance pass for strength. Will told himself that he was different from his father, less ruthless and more controlled, but lately, he had started to show signs of weakness. And every time RJ entered the room, those cracks got bigger. A competition becomes personal. It was a design pitch that pushed them over the edge. RJ had been working quietly with Eric Forrester to improve a line that combined modern minimalism with classic Forrester style. When the presentation wowed everyone praised it, especially Ridge, who was clearly proud of his son. Not only did RJ get professional approval, but he also got emotional validation that he didn't even know he needed. Will stood on the sidelines with his jaw tight and his hands clenched. He had been pushing his own ideas for weeks, trying to get people to take him seriously. But here was RJ, effortless, praised and welcomed. Felt like erasure to Will. Will later that day confronted RJ in a quiet part of the design floor. What began as a harsh comment turned into accusations of favoritism, Ridge pulling strings and RJ playing the innocent artist, while getting everything Will thought he was being denied. RJ tried to calm things down. He always did. But this time Will didn't let it go. The night when everything went wrong. Forrester Creations was not the site of the real explosion. Will thought it happened hours later, away from people who could see it. RJ had stayed late to finish up some sketches. The parking lot was almost empty when he left the building. Will's voice broke the silence, and the sound of footsteps behind him barely registered. What happened next was not a fight between friends. It wasn't a fight that got too heated. It was one-sided, violent, and fueled by weeks of bottled anger. Will told RJ that he was stealing his future, that he was hiding behind Ridge's name, and that he never had to fight for anything. RJ tried to talk to him, but Will pushed him. Then he hit him. And then he just kept going. Later, security cameras would show pieces of the horror that were enough to put it all together. RJ hit the concrete hard. Will stood over him, fists flying, long after RJ had stopped fighting back. When someone finally found RJ, he was unconscious, bleeding and barely breathing. The hospital watch. It was the middle of the night when the call came in. Ridge Forrester came to the hospital as if he had lost touch with reality. Seeing his son lying still in a hospital bed with a swollen face, broken ribs, and a bandaged head broke something deep inside him. This wasn't work. This wasn't a competition. This was his kid. Doctors spoke in careful tones about a concussion, internal injuries, and a lot of bruising. RJ was lucky to still be alive. When Ridge asked who did this, the answer hit him like a bullet. Spencer Will. Ridge's anger. Ridge's response was quick and explosive. There was no mistake about this. This wasn't a fight. This was an attack. Ridge wanted answers, wanted people to be held accountable, and wanted justice. He called the police on his own. He called lawyers before the sun came up. And when he finally talked to Bill Spencer, there was no room for negotiation. Ridge promised to sue Will until he was broke. But that wasn't enough. He wanted Will to go to jail. Ridge's voice shook with anger as he said, "You can't do this and walk away. Not to my son. Never." Bill didn't have a quick answer this time. He could defend business deals, change the outcome, and break the rules, but what Will had done was clear. Bill couldn't even pay to get rid of the footage, witnesses, and hospital report. The fallout. The charges were bad. Assault with a deadly weapon. There was a very real chance of going to jail. Will, who had been so defiant, now sat alone, the weight of what he had done finally hitting him. He told himself he didn't mean to go that far, but intent didn't change what happened. There was no excuse that could make RJ's injuries less serious. When the Forrester family gathered around RJ's bedside, feelings were strong. Brooke blamed herself for not noticing the tension sooner. Eric felt bad about himself and wondered if praise and legacy had made people angry without meaning to. Ridge stayed with RJ, sleeping in a chair and refusing to leave. RJ had only one question when he finally opened his eyes. Why? A story that will change the future. This plot isn't just about violence. It's also about legacy, masculinity, privilege, and responsibility, which are all themes that the bold and the beautiful has been dealing with for years. Dads and sons, power and privilege, the price of rage that isn't controlled. Will's actions will change his path for good. RJ's recovery, both physically and mentally, will take time. Ridge's relationship with the Spencers may be too broken to fix. And as legal battles get closer, one truth becomes clear. There are some lines that once crossed can never be crossed again. There was a smell of antiseptic and fear in the hospital room. RJ Forrester lay still under thin white sheets. Machines hummed quietly next to him, and his chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. The dark, angry bruises on his face were impossible to miss. They were reminders of the violence that almost killed him. Ridge Forrester sat close to the bed, holding his son's hand tightly, as if sheer willpower could keep RJ connected to the world. There was no competition between businesses. There was no mistake here. This was a father watching his child suffer because of someone else's anger. Ridge Forrester goes too far and can't go back. Ridge had been through a lot of wars in his life, like corporate takeovers, romantic betrayals, and family feuds, but nothing had prepared him for this. Every breath RJ took felt like a fragile miracle, and as the hours went by, Ridge's grief turned into something much more dangerous. Make up your mind. When the sun rose over Los Angeles, Ridge had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let the Spencer family cover this up with apologies or make it go away. He wanted people to be responsible, and he wanted consequences that would last. Ridge told the family's lawyer to go after the most serious criminal charges. He asked for civil action to pay for the damage. And when Brooke gently suggested that RJ's recovery should come first, Ridge snapped back with a truth that no one could deny. Ridge's voice broke as he said, "If I don't do this now, will learn that he can hurt someone and walk away. I won't let my son's blood go to waste." Bill Spencer is in the one crisis he can't control. Bill Spencer had always used power to get what he wanted. Money was a tool. Influence was armor. But as he stood alone in his living room, staring at his phone that was full of calls from lawyers that he hadn't answered, one truth hit him hard. He couldn't fix this. The security video was terrible. There was no doubt about the hospital report. People felt very sorry for the Forresters. Even worse, Will had told Bill late at night, with a shaky voice, that he lost control. Bill had built an empire on being aggressive, but this wasn't ambition. This was an attack. Bill had to face the fact for the first time that his son might go to jail, not because of enemies or conspiracies, but because of what he did. Will Spencer breaks. Will had always thought that being angry made him stronger. That was survival for him. Standing his ground, pushing back, and refusing to feel small. But when he was alone in the interrogation room, going over the moment RJ hit the ground, something inside him broke. He didn't want to keep hitting him. That thought kept going around and around in his head, empty and useless. It didn't matter what they meant. What happened did. And RJ's injuries were so bad that it was easy for prosecutors to prove that he had committed a felony. When Will was finally let out on bail, cameras were everywhere. Headlines went crazy. Spencer heir accused of brutal assault. Forrester son in hospital after attack. Overnight, Will became a pariah. RJ wakes up, and the truth hurts more than the pain. RJ slowly woke up, his eyes clouded with confusion as the pain set in. When he finally looked at Ridge's face, he felt a huge sense of relief, but it didn't last long. Because then the questions came. The doctors talked about the injuries. Ridge talked about the attack. Brooke carefully filled in the blanks with words. But no amount of explanation could change the truth. Someone RJ had trusted and tried to stay out of trouble with almost killed him. RJ didn't get angry. He didn't cry. He stopped talking. Ridge was more scared of that silence than of any outburst. A family split up by justice. As the case went on, tensions tore families apart from the inside. Some people wondered if prison was the right thing to do. Some people thought Ridge was going too far. But Ridge wouldn't change his mind. He kept saying, "This isn't revenge. It's for protection. For RJ. For everyone." Bill, on the other hand, had to face his own judgment. His first instinct was to protect Will, but the more he tried, the more it became clear that defending the indefensible would only ruin what little credibility Will had left. The father and son fought a lot. Will told Bill for the first time that he had taught him that violence was power. Bill didn't have a defense. The silence between them spoke volumes. Drama in the courtroom is coming up. As the arraignment got closer, rumors spread through Los Angeles. Would Will agree to a plea deal? Would Ridge give a statement? Would RJ be able to fight the man who attacked him? The courtroom was going to be the next place where people fought in a war that had already taken too much. And when RJ finally told Ridge that he would testify, even though he was scared and traumatized, Ridge understood something very important. His son wasn't weak. He was very brave. A big change for the bold and the beautiful. This plot twist is a huge change for the show. It takes legacy characters down to their most basic truths and makes people talk about violence, privilege, and responsibility without making any of it look cool. Spencer's future is hanging by a thread. RJ Forrester's recovery will change who he is. Ridge Forrester is no longer just a designer or a father. He is now a father fighting for justice. What about the fight between Spencer and Forrester? It might never get better. Behind barricades, reporters gathered, their voices overlapping as they talked about plea deals, sentencing guidelines, and whether the name Spencer would once again break the law. But inside there was no glamour, only fear. Ridge Forrester got there early, and his face looked like it was made of stone. He wore a dark suit that was always clean, but nothing about him seemed polished. This wasn't a war over style. This was to stay alive. RJ walked slowly next to him, taking his time with each step. Even though the bruises had faded, the damage was still there. His hands shook slightly and his posture was stiff and guarded. Memory took longer to heal than physical wounds. Today, RJ would have to face the man who almost killed him. Will Spencer walks into the courtroom. The room changed when Will came in. The cockiness and arrogance were gone. Instead, there was a young man who had been hollowed out by what had happened. His eyes instinctively looked around the gallery for Bill. For someone. To make sure he wasn't alone. Bill Spencer looked at him for a moment before looking away. That one moment hurt more than any sentence ever could. The judge told everyone to be quiet. The charges were read out loud. Aggravated battery and felony assault. Every word hit hard, was unavoidable, and would last forever. Will swallowed hard and held his hands tightly in his lap. This wasn't a business meeting. This was real life. Ridge testifies. A father's anger that he can control. Ridge was the first to testify. He spoke clearly and slowly as he talked about the phone call that woke him up in the middle of the night. The hospital. The devices. Seeing RJ broken and not moving. Ridge said firmly, "This wasn't a fight. My son didn't get a chance to defend himself." The prosecution gave the words some space. Ridge's voice only broke once, when he talked about holding RJ's hand and not knowing if his son could hear him. There was no noise in the courtroom. Even the defense didn't look the other person in the eye. Ridge didn't want to punish Will for this. It was about saying the truth. RJ Forrester takes the stand. Ridge's breath stopped when RJ called. Everyone in the room was watching RJ as he slowly walked to the witness stand. He didn't look at Will yet. He focused on what was in front of him, using the facts to ground himself just like Eric had taught him to do. Design. One line at a time. RJ talked about the fight in a calm way. The claims. The push. The first hit. Then his voice broke. "I remember hitting the ground," RJ said in a low voice, "and thinking, this isn't going to stop." At that point he turned to Will and looked at him. Not with hate. With disbelief. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. Will even saw it and jumped. RJ didn't make things up. He didn't make a big deal out of it. That restraint made what he said very powerful. As Ridge stepped down, he instinctively stood up and held his son steady as they walked back to their seats. The gesture said everything that words couldn't. Bill Spencer's breaking point. Next they called Bill. Bill Spencer, who was once a great man, looked small under fluorescent lights for the first time in decades. He said that he had raised Will in an environment of power, competition, and conflict. He said he didn't encourage violence, but the idea stayed. "Do you think your son should be punished?" the prosecutor asked. Bill thought for a moment. "Yes," he finally said. That one word sounded like a confession. Will stared at his father, shocked. He wasn't angry or relieved. He was just lost. Bill couldn't look him in the eye again. The decision took hours to think about it. No one breathed when the jury came back. The foreperson said, "On the charge of felony assault, we find the defendant guilty." Will shut his eyes. Ridge let out a breath. RJ stayed still, as if he was afraid that moving would change reality. The sentence was set for a later date, but the message was clear. Legacy did not mean immunity. Aftermath. Things never go back to normal. In the weeks that followed, people's lives changed to fit the truth. Will waited for his sentence under strict conditions, with no privileges and a future limited to court dates and required counseling. Not as a threat but as a reckoning, the possibility of prison loomed. Bill went into hiding because he couldn't stop thinking about how his idea of strength had let his son down. RJ started therapy in a quiet, private way. There were nightmares. He couldn't handle being in crowded rooms. But over time he found his voice again, using his trauma to create designs and sketches that showed both brokenness and strength. Ridge felt something change inside him as he watched his son rebuild. To protect RJ now meant trusting his strength instead of keeping him safe. A line that will never be crossed. The Spencer-Forrester fight had gone too far to go back. There was no more competition. It was history that was written down in court records and medical records. And while people in Los Angeles talked about sentencing, redemption, and ruin, one thing was clear. There were consequences for violence. Legacy did not erase guilt. And surviving didn't mean forgetting. This time, cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom. No more points to make. Only consequences are waiting to be delivered. Will Spencer stood next to his lawyer with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, making his knuckles white. He hadn't slept well in weeks because he kept remembering things he couldn't get away from, like the sound of RJ hitting the ground, the silence that followed, and the sick feeling that he had gone too far. RJ Forrester sat with Ridge and Brooke on the other side of the aisle. He wore a tailored jacket that hid the tension in his shoulders, but the emotional scars were too deep to hide. RJ didn't want to go. He had already given so much to the testimony, but he still came, because some things needed to be seen. The judge talks. The judge's voice was calm, steady, and clear, and it didn't show any mercy. "This court knows how serious the harm was," she said. "This wasn't an accident. This was a long-term act of violence." Will's breath stopped.